Okay, so we're going to start complex numbers. The first thing I would do if I were you is I would make a list. This is the list I would make. You need to know that if you have I to the 0, it's going to be equal to 1. If you have I to the first, that's just equal to I. If you have I squared, that's going to be equal to negative 1. And if you have I to the third, that's going to be equal to negative I. And then the cool thing about this is it repeats. These four things that I equal keep repeating. So like if I wanted to go I to the fourth, it'd be 1. So you see like 1. And then if I did I to the fifth, it'd be I. And if I did I to the sixth, it'd be negative 1. And if I did I to the seventh, it'd be negative I. So you see this is a pattern, and it's just going to keep repeating. So first, what is I? I is an imaginary unit. And when we use imaginary units is when we take the square root of a negative. So let me show you how we're going to use this. What if I told you to simplify the square root of negative 48? In the past, you've always just been like, oh, you can't do that. Can't take the square root of a negative. Well, now, guess what? Some guy sometime said, oh, we're going to make imaginary numbers so that we can do this. It's actually not really that difficult. I'm going to show you how to do it. So, first off, it's the square root. So we want to figure out what perfect square will go into 48. And it actually ends up being 16. So I have a negative 1 times 16 times 3. Right? Because if I multiply those 3, I did the negative 1 to get rid of that negative, and then 16 times 3 is 48. So the square root of 16 is 4, so that goes on the outside. Can't take the square root of 3. The square root of negative 1 is I. So I'm going to have 4I square root 3. And that's your answer. Let's do another one. Let's simplify the square root of negative 63. Again, I want to figure out what will go into 63. So I'm going to do negative 1. That gets rid of my negative. 63 is really 9 times 7. So the square root of 9 is 3. The square root of negative 1 is I. And what's left is a 7. So that's how you're going to do 1, 2, and 3 on your worksheet. Let me do one more. I'll let you guys try one just to make sure you really got this. So I want you to simplify the square root of negative 80. So pause it, work it out, see if you can get it, and then unpause it, and I'll help you back out. Okay, so hopefully you got the answer. This is really negative 1 times 16 times 5. So the square root of 16 is 4. The square root of square root of negative 1 is I. And you should have a 4 left over. Okay? So that'll get you through 1, 2, and 3 on your worksheet. Number 4 on your worksheet is going to look like this. Let's do 3 plus I times 2 minus, let's leave it. Do 3 minus I. Alright, so this is number 4 on your worksheet. Again, it's pretty easy. We're going to do FOIL. We're going to double distribution, whatever you want to call it. So 3 times 3 is 9. 3 times negative I is negative 3I. I times 3 is 3I. And I times negative I is negative I squared. Treat it just like it's an X or a Y or an A or a B. Okay, so if you look at these middle terms, negative 3 plus 3, they cancel. So those go away. So I have 9 minus I squared. This is where that table is going to come in handy. If you look at that table that you just wrote down, we know that I squared is really just negative 1. So instead of I squared, we're going to put negative 1. So 9 minus negative 1 is just 10. So that worked out nice and neat. Let me do one more like that, or I'm going to let you guys try one more like that. And then I'll go through the answer just to make sure we're good. So let's do 2 plus 2i. And let's do 2 minus 2i. So pause it, try and do that distribution, and then unpause it, and I'll make sure you did it right. Okay, hopefully you got an answer. Here's how it is. 2 times 2 is 4. You get negative 4i. You get positive 4i. You get negative 4i squared. Your middle terms, negative 4i plus 4i, those go away. So I have 4 minus 4. If you remember, I squared is really negative 1. So negative 4 times negative 1 is actually a positive 4, and 4 plus 4 is 8. So that answer should have been 8. Okay, the next part of your worksheet will look something like this. Let's do 6x squared plus 42 equals 0. And it's going to say solve this. Okay, so let's solve it. We start by subtracting 42. So we get 6x squared equals negative 42. Divide by 6. We get x squared equals negative 7. To get rid of squareds, we're going to do the square root of both sides. So we're going to do square root, square root. So x equals the square root of negative 7. 7 won't simplify, but I can take that negative out because the square root, let me write it like this. This is really negative 1 times 7. And I do know that the square root of negative 1 is I. So that would be I, square root 7. And whenever you do the square root, you need to put that it could be a positive or a negative. So that answer is actually positive or negative I square root 7. Let me give you another problem because I'm sure some of you are a little bit confused. Let's do another one. Let's do 5x squared equals negative 5. We're going to solve this. So I'm going to start by dividing by 5. So I get x squared equals negative 1. To get rid of the x squared, we're going to do the square root. So those cancel, and I get x equals, again, it could be a positive or negative, square root negative 1. Well, this is really, we know the square root of negative 1 is I. So the x could be a positive or negative I. Let's do another one. Let's do 2x squared plus 84 equals 0. So we would subtract 84. 2x squared equals negative 84. We would divide by 2. So x squared equals negative 42. We do the square root of both sides. So I get x equals the square root, could be a positive or a negative, of negative 42. Okay, so I can take that negative out with an I. So x could equal plus or minus I square root 42. So that gets you through with the front side of the page, or the first page. The second page is all about adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing i's. So it's actually not too difficult. Let's do this problem. Let's do 2 plus 4i plus 3 minus 2i. It's just like pretend I is a variable. You're going to combine your like terms. So I can combine 2 and 3 and get 5. And I can combine my i's. 4 plus negative 2 and get positive 2i. And that's just your answer. You don't go any further. Same thing with subtraction. Let me do a subtraction one. I'm just going to actually do the exact same problem, but I'm going to make it a subtraction. So stick with your whole numbers. 2 minus 3 is negative 1. And you can subtract your i's. 4 minus negative 2. Remember that minus negative turns to plus. So it's actually a positive 6i. Let's multiply some. Let's do 3 plus I times 2 minus I. 3 times 2 is 6. 3 times negative I is negative 3I. I times 2 is 2I. And I times I is I squared. I got to bring down my 6. My middle ones combine, and that gives me negative 1I. And if you remember, I squared is really negative 1. So a negative 1 is a positive 1. Now I can combine these and get 7 minus I. And that's your answer. The last thing that you'll need to know how to do is dividing with i's. So let's do this problem. Let's do 6 over 2 plus I. You want to multiply by the conjugate, which just means the opposite. So I'm going to multiply by 2 minus I over 2 minus I. So on top, I'm going to do 6 times 2 and get 12. I'm going to do 6 times I and get 6I. On bottom, I'm going to do 2 times 2 and get 4. A shortcut, you don't have to do FOIL, and this is why we do the conjugate. Your middle two terms are going to cancel out. So I'm just going to do the first two and the last two. So I times negative I is negative I squared. Now, watch what I'm going to do here. I know I squared is negative 1. So on bottom, I really have 4 minus a negative 1, which is 5. So I have 12 minus 6I on top and 5 on bottom. Let me do one more like that just to make sure we're really good with this concept. Let's do 3 plus 6I over 2I. To get rid of it, we're going to multiply by the conjugate, which is negative 2I over negative 2I. So on top, I'm going to get negative 6I, right there, distributing. And 6 times 2 is negative 12I squared. On bottom, 2 times negative 2 is negative 4. And I times I is I squared. So next step, I'm going to get rid of all these I squareds and make them negative 1s. Because I squared is negative 1. So on top, I'm going to have negative 6I. A negative 12 and a negative 1 multiplied to give a positive 12. And on bottom, negative 4 times negative 1 multiplies to give a positive 4. Now you can reduce this. I'm not going to get into that. If you just want to leave your answer like this, that's totally fine. Alright, so try the worksheet. Let me know if you need any help.